We will begin in 60 seconds.
Kia ora tātou nei e te muta. Kia ora tātou, kei roto tēnei kaupapa nui o tātou tēnei rā. Nō reira, kei te mihi nui, kei te mihi nui, kei te mihi nui ki a tātou. Ka te rā kei te mihi nui hoki nei ki a rātou, ko wihata ki tō tā ārai. Tēnei rā, tērā tino rangatira, Dr. Moana Jackson, e riru atu ki ngā tipuna tēnei rā. Nō reira, koutou, haere ana koutou nā mate, aha ko no hia, aha ko ihe koutou, pēnei mai te mihi ki a koutou haere. Kia nai tātou hoki nei, e hui mai ki roto tēnei kaupapa, tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Timata mai nei, tēnei tō tātou nei kaupapa ke runga hoki nei te reo karakia. Ka te rā, ke runga ke tō tātou nei whaka. E te ariki nui. Ko whakarake koe nei mātou hoki nei o whanana. Kia whiriwhiri mai nā kōrero o te kaupapa hira nei. Ko ta mana o te tangata, ko tō mātou nei painga e nohaka ke runga te mata o tēnei whenua no reira whakapiri mai kia mātou. Whakanui ana mātou kia takoto pai e nei kōrero mō te manakitanga, mō te apina tanguki o tēnā, o tātou, kei rungo hoki nei tēnei kaupapa nui. Nō reira matua manaki tia, whakapiri mai. Ka tira, hāpai tia mātou ki te kawerine wani tātou ke rungu tō aroha ke rungu tō pai. Nō reira matua, whakatūwhera nei, tēnei tō tātou nei hui tanga tēnei wā, ke rungu hoki te ngua tapu tō tātou kai whakaora ake, āmene. Kia ora tātou whānau, mihi nui. Today is also the day that our Kaumātua, our rangatira Moana Jackson will be buried today. But he talked about those things which are important to us under the treaty, but about how we as a people can best live together with one another. These things, thoughts we have about racism, about disabling us in our own place, is a legacy that we should probably think about and consider, and it should be part of the kōrero which is happening today. And I'm so happy that eventually we got to a place in space where we can continue the discussion of what we're going to be, how it impacts and affects us. Nō reira as a people. Nō reira e te whānau, tēnā koutou, huri no, tēnā hoki tātou anō.
Te aroha,
te whakapono, me te rangi
mari
e tātou e. Nō reira huri no, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou nei, ka huri nei.
Ai, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koe, Ron, te kai karakia I tēnei rā. Tēnā hoki koe mātua, mō te tōtoko mai I tātou I tēnei hui. Kia ora mō ngā kupu, mō ngā whakaro I tēnei wā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo raurangatira mā tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Paula Tesarero, tōku ingoa, ko o te kaihutu, tika hauatanga, mō te kāhui, tika tangata ki Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi ki a koe mātua Ron and Whaia Ranel for setting our pathway for today. And mātua Ron, thank you for acknowledging the passing of Moana Jackson, who undoubtedly had such a significant impact in Aotearoa and around the world for his work, and particularly want to acknowledge today his tremendous input into human rights for all in Aotearoa, and particularly today thinking about the impacts and the human rights for disabled people and tangata whaikaha Māori. So thank you for that. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome everybody to the IMM's forum on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where today we are talking about integrity of the person. This is our 5th session. We're meeting today and tomorrow, having had 2 sessions last week. Can I welcome all government officials to this forum today? Can I acknowledge my IMM partners, the Office of the Ombudsman, the Disabled People's Organisation Coalition, and all of our staff and leaders in our respective organisations? And can I acknowledge all of those who are listening today, in particular whānau and other disabled people from around Aotearoa. Today's session will be broken into 3 parts. The first part will have an opening statement by the IMM, followed by a series of questions that the IMM will put to the government, and the government will respond to each question. In that first part, there won't be a lot of dialogue, in fact, very limited dialogue between the IMM and government, although if, as the chair, I need to seek clarification on any response, I will do that. We then move into part 2, where the IMM will deliberate on the government's responses and prepare a set of supplementary questions to ask the government in part 3, where we all return and we will put our supplementary questions to the government for response. If you're listening to today's session and want to contribute questions, can I encourage you please to do that in part 1? You can do that using Slido. The instructions for that will be in the same material that you used to join this session. We warmly welcome you sending questions through. You need to do that though, please, in part 1, so that when the IMM deliberates on the government's responses, we can look at the questions that have come through Slido and determine which questions to ask. We won't be able to get through all of them, but we will do our best, and those we can't get to, we will follow up with government at a later date. Just finally, a message for government officials: when you speak today, can you please look at the camera so that people who need to lip read can do so more easily? And also, can you please say your name and your agency before you speak, so that those who are blind or have low vision know who it is that is speaking. Without further ado from me, I am going to hand over for the IMM's opening statement to Leo Mcintyre from Balance Aotearoa. Kia ora, Leo.
Te hei mauri ora, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā tangata whenua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. E nā tangata whaikaha, nau mai haere mai. Ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. A very warm welcome to our disabled whānau. Ko Leo Mcintyre taku ingoa, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. It is known that the rates of disabled adults' experience of violence and abuse are disproportionately higher than rates of violence experienced by non-disabled people. Disabled adults are more likely than other adults to be subject to sexual assault. Disabled adults are significantly more likely than other adults to experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. New Zealand Health Survey data from 2020 and 2021 shows that disabled adults are less likely to report good, very good, or excellent health compared with non-disabled adults. Around 20% of disabled adults report not visiting a GP due to cost, compared to 12.7% of non-disabled adults. Disabled adults are 3.8 times more likely than non-disabled adults to be unable to collect a prescription due to cost. Disabled adults are 6.1 times as likely as non-disabled adults to have experienced psychological distress. Disabled people have the right to be respected for who they are and treated on an equal basis with others. Disabled people should be supported to make decisions about matters that affect health, well-being, and integrity. Unfortunately, some disabled New Zealanders are still denied the opportunity to have control over their well-being and integrity due to substitute decision-making practices still prevalent in New Zealand. Disabled people want New Zealand to move to a supported decision-making approach where they have more control over their own destiny. New Zealand needs to move towards reducing outdated and cruel practices such as seclusion or solitary confinement and restraint. The IMM remains concerned at the continued use of seclusion and restraint practices in New Zealand's prisons and healthcare facilities. Although there are often alternative options available to manage challenging behaviour, solitary confinement and restraint are not always used only as a last resort. Disabled New Zealanders, particularly those with learning and psychosocial disabilities, continue to experience inequities in life expectancy. Disabled people want and expect health services to treat them right when they are unwell. Like everyone else, disabled people want to get on with living good and long lives. Disabled people remain concerned about the disproportionately negative impact the End of Life Choice Act may have on them, especially that the Act lacks safeguards against coercion and devalues the integrity of disability. Concern also remains that there is no legislation in place to prohibit sterilisation or any other non-therapeutic medical procedure on disabled children and adults. Disabled people want their lives to be valued on an equal basis with all others and to be meaningfully represented in decisions that affect their lives. Disabled people also consider it fundamentally important that that they have the same protection from violence and abuse as non-disabled people, and that agencies are positioned appropriately to prevent agencies are positioned to appropriately prevent and respond to the abuse disabled people experience. Government must take urgent steps to ensure that disabled people are afforded the right to make their decisions about their own lives and have control over their well-being and integrity. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui, Leo. Thank you for that opening statement to set the scene for the questions that the IMM are putting to the government this morning. And I'm going to hand back to you, Leo Mcintyre from Balance Aotearoa to ask the first question of government. Kia ora, Leo.
Kia ora, Paula. Leo speaking. The Health Quality and Safety Commission announced plans for a national project to attempt, quote, zero seclusion, unquote, by 2020. How can the government justify continuing the use of seclusion or solitary confinement and restraint practices in New Zealand?
Ngā mihi nui, Leo. Can I turn to you, Audrey, in the first instance to coordinate the government's response, please?
Kia ora, Paula and Leo. Audrey Isbister. I'm the DDG Disability at the Ministry of Health, and I have a more high-level statement to respond to that, which does include the question, Leo, and then we'll go into more detail. I just, and I really wanted to toko your opening statement, Leo, very profound, and particularly for government officials. So the government does recognise that disabled people currently experience inequitable life outcomes, including poorer health outcomes and higher rates of violence and abuse than their non-disabled peers. This is not acceptable, and the government is committed to working in partnership with the disability community to change this. Achieving better outcomes for disabled people in whānau depends on transforming how government works with them. The call for nothing about us, without us, is central both to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and to New Zealand's commitments under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We know that an overall lack of coordination and system stewardship hinders our ability to achieve the step change in engagement and outcomes that disabled people are looking for. The establishment of the Ministry for Disabled People from the 1st of July this year will provide strong and focused leadership of the disability system across government. Having an agency that has been designed from the onset to incorporate the voice of disabled people at all levels of decision making is an important step. At the same time, it is vital that all agencies, including the Ministry of Health and the new entities that will be established as part of these health reforms, strengthen our work to better meet the needs of disabled people. As part of the health reforms, the Paiora Healthy Futures Bill has been introduced. This bill formally recognises the poor outcomes experienced by disabled people and identifies them as key equity groups in the health system. The bill includes a requirement for the Ministry of Health to prepare a dedicated disability health strategy that will provide a framework to guide the health system in improving health outcomes for disabled people. As well as lifting outcomes, we know there is a lot of other work the government needs to do to restrict or remove outdated practices such as seclusion and restraint. We recognise that seclusion and restraint are not therapeutic and can be harmful to both disabled people and staff. He Aora Oranga, the report of the Independent Inquiry into Mental Health and Addiction, recognised that the Mental Health Act does not reflect best practice or align with our international commitments, and that New Zealand has high rates of compulsion and seclusion. The Ministry of Health is committed to the reduction and elimination of seclusion and restraint in mental health services, and we have a program of work that supports this goal. We've introduced new guidelines for the Mental Health Act with a greater focus on human rights and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We're working on a training program alongside Te Pou, which is a mental health and addiction workforce development centre, to support good practice in the use of the Mental Health Act and to promote awareness and understanding about people's health rights. The mental health sector is also working to reduce and eliminate seclusion in mental health services as part of the zero seclusion. Safety and dignity for all collaborative project between Health and Quality Safety Commission, District Health Boards and Te Pou, as well as projects to support changes in culture and practice within mental health services. There is also a significant work program within of legislative change. The government accepted the recommendation to repeal and replace the Mental Health Act, and this work is well underway. The government is firmly committed to the safety of disabled people and recognises that this requires coordinated and collective efforts of many sectors and organisations. In this session, you will hear from several government agencies on their responsibilities and contributions to this mahi, where disabled people and tangata whai kaha Māori are clearly identified as priority populations. In particular, and aligned with your first question, Leo, the government's joint venture business board on eliminating family violence and sexual violence. There is a new, and you'll hear more about it, New Zealand's first national strategy and action plan to eliminate family violence and sexual violence. Government agencies are responsible for delivering many of these actions. The government also acknowledges that the End of Life Choice Act is a sensitive issue for the disability community, whose rights and agency have too often been disregarded. The End of Life Choice Act 2019 contains with it many safeguards that in practice protect against some of the concerns raised. In addition, the Act includes monitoring mechanisms and opportunities to review how well the legislation is functioning. This provides an opportunity to scrutinise the impact of the legislation on disabled people. The Act will also benefit from work that is happening elsewhere in the health and disability systems, such as workforce training and supported decision-making measures. To conclude, the government recognises that there is much work to do to achieve equitable outcomes for disabled people and to better align our systems with the intent of the UN CRPD, the Disability Strategy and Action Plan. However, the government is taking concrete steps to address inequity, ensure that disabled people are valued on an equal basis with others, and to have control over decisions that affect their lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Are there any other officials that are going to add to that? John.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm John Crawshaw. I'm the Director of Mental Health and Addiction at the Ministry of Health. The Zero Seclusion Towards Elimination of Seclusion by 2020 project was a collaboration, collaborative quality improvement project between the HQSC and the mental health and addiction sector. The HQSC worked with the sector to set up internationally an aspirational goal of zero seclusion. Over time, the project has retained the focus on elimination of seclusion, but has changed the title to Zero Seclusion, Safety and Dignity for All, emphasising the importance of safety and dignity for tangata whai ora and whānau, but also for staff. Progress has been made in the past 4 years of the project, with some DHBs now achieving zero seclusion for periods of time. It has been a challenging process, but we are seeing downward trends in people being secluded and the duration of seclusion. The HQSC has told us that their data also shows that the rate of Māori and Pacific people being secluded is reducing at a faster rate than that for non-Māori, non-Pacific. This indicates that we're making some progress in reducing the known inequities experienced by some groups who experience seclusion in Aotearoa. The Zero Seclusion Project has recently produced a change package incorporating a clinical bundle and a cultural keti to showcase practices which demonstrate effective seclusion reduction. The Ministry of Health is committed to the reduction and elimination of seclusion and restraint in the mental health services, and we have a program of work that supports the National Zero Seclusion Project. In 2020, we released new guidelines for the Mental Health Act, the new guidelines have a greater focus on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and human rights principles. For example, the guidelines encourage supported decision-making approach to give effect to a person's wishes, such as through advanced directives or collaborative crisis team plans. To implement these guidelines, we have developed the training program alongside Te Pau, one of the National Mental Health and Addiction Workforce Centres, to support good practice in the mental health workforce in the use of the Mental Health Act to promote awareness and understanding about people's rights. This initiative began in 2021 with an e-learning and resourcing package being developed for the sector use later in 2022. We're also working on new guidelines for seclusion and restraint under the Mental Health Act. The new guidelines will have a focus on preventing and eliminating seclusion and restraint, and the safe usage of restrictive practices when they cannot be avoided. The working group for the development of the guidelines includes the perspectives of Māori and the lived experience community, as well as a representative from the Disabled Persons Organisations Coalition. There will be a targeted consultation on the draft guidelines mid-year. In addition, guidelines for the use of seclusion under the Intellectual Disability, Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act 2003 were also updated in 2020. They will continue to be updated to reflect the ongoing changes to the Mental Health Act. Since 2017, seclusion data for those under the Intellectual Disability Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act 2003, or IDCCNR, have been disaggregated from the data provided for individuals under the Mental Health Act to give a better understanding of the use of seclusion for individuals under IDCCNR who reside in hospital-level intellectual disability and intellectual disability forensic services. He ora the report of the independent inquiry into mental health and addiction recognised the Mental Health Act does not reflect best practice or align with our international commitments, and that New Zealand has high rates of compulsion and seclusion. He ora Aranga recommended that the government repeal and replace the Mental Health Act so that it reflects human rights approaches and promotes supported decision-making, aligns with the recovery and well-being model of mental health, and provides measures to minimise compulsive or coercive treatment. The government has accepted the recommendation to repeal and replace the Act, and a program of work is underway. We have already made changes to the Mental Health Act that respond to the human rights concerns. For example, an amendment to the Act in 2021 removed the ability for compulsory treatment orders to last for an indefinite period. This amendment will be enforced in October 2023. Public consultation for the repeal of the Mental Health Act closed at the end of January this year. The consultation document sought people's views on whether the new legislation should ever allow the use of seclusion, restraint, or restrictive practices, and if so, what requirements should be in place to ensure people's rights are protected and the use is appropriately limited. We have heard why change is needed, and the next step is to get clear direction for what the mental health legislation in New Zealand should look like.
Thank you, Audrey and John. John, I just have a couple of clarifying questions for you. The first is, you talked earlier about some DHBs reducing their rates of seclusion and restraint. Do you know how many DHBs of the total number?
Not off the top of my head, but we certainly provided a follow-up if need be.
Okay, thank you for that. I said I had a couple, sorry, I only had one. And my apologies, it's Paula Tesorero speaking. Just one other general question. Is there anyone from corrections or education who wants to add to that question about justification for the use of seclusion and restraint? Juanita, kia ora. You don't have to add anything, just want to give you the opportunity to.
Kia ora, Paula. Kōnes Rantuku Ingoa, and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive for the Haura Rōpū at Corrections. I'm going to pass to my colleague Neil Beals who is also on the call, Paula, the Chief Custodial Officer for Corrections, to respond.
Thank you. Kia ora, Neil.
Kia ora. My name is Neil Beals. I'm the Chief Custodial Officer for the Department of Corrections. And our response to that would be that we are committed to improving the conditions for people on all management regimes. And we're balancing this against the need to maintain, of course, the safety and security of prisons. For corrections, segregation will continue to be a critical management option that is used to ensure safety, particularly where a person presents a serious risk of violence to other people in prison, risk themselves or others who may pose a risk to them. It's important to note that people subject to segregation directions may have their ability to associate with other prisons restricted, not just denied. Segregation is not synonymous with non-association. People who are segregated or subject to self-confinement and the at-risk regime continue to receive their minimum rights and entitlements to exercise, see visitors, receive mail, make calls, and have regular contact with health services, except where these rights and entitlements are denied in accordance with the Act. Whilst on segregation, people can continue to have access to education and training opportunities, and to note that people under an at-risk management plan in intervention and support units are not able to access this. In terms of access to psychological services, psychological services provides assessment and individual offence-focused rehabilitative interventions to people in our care who have been assessed as high risk for reoffending across the prison estate based on eligibility and position in the local service list, essentially a queue, regardless of their unit or residence on segregation status. People in the management unit have the same access to individual psychological intervention as people in other units, although group programs are generally delivered in the low, medium or high medium units. People residing in a management unit can also attend the group-based rehabilitative activities, and we are strengthening our processes to reduce the need for seclusion practices. For example, we are strengthening health services by hiring more frontline mental health staff, implementing a better needs assessment and providing better service delivery. Health centre nurses undergo primary mental health training, and earlier identification will mean that people get support at the right time and in the right place and reduce the need for seclusion practices. There is a review underway of the maximum security classification and use of segregation in women's prisons by the Women's Prison Network Improvement Programme, the WPNIP. And this work is underpinned by the strategic direction of Hokairangi and the women's strategy, Rera Anati Kitapaiho, to ensure that there's an approach that meets the needs of women. And I'll touch on the use of restraint. Unfortunately, sometimes our prison-based staff will need to use physical force on people in our care for their safety or ours. Staff may use force only when there is no other option. Through effective tactical communication, de-escalation techniques and decision-making, physical force can usually be avoided. We note that there are concerns about the use of restraints on youth and those with disabilities. We consider that the use of restraint in some circumstances is necessary to ensure the safety and well-being of the people in our care and our staff, because if somebody is young and or disabled, they can still be a security and safety risk. Having a disability does not in itself necessarily mean restraints cannot be used. An assessment of the risk the person poses, the security classification, and the reason why mechanical restraint may be required are all part of the assessment. Similarly for youth, although we no longer routinely accommodate 17-year-old prisoners, we will need to use mechanical restraints such as handcuffs on occasion. Physical restraint is used when it is necessary, reasonable, and proportionate. If someone is abusive, threatening violence, attempting to escape, or attempting to harm themselves, for example, and de-escalation has not been successful, it may be necessary to physically restrain somebody. The legislation permits us to do this as long as I said, the level of force used is proportionate, reasonable, and necessary in the circumstances. Corrections is also enabled to use a very limited range of mechanical restraints in some circumstances, notably handcuffs. Noting corrections work as well to revoke tie-down beds in 2019 as a restraint option. Corrections maintains oversight over the use of force with detailed reporting requirements for the use of any mechanical restraints applied to the prisoner during an incident, spontaneous use of force, including individual carry pepper spray, and planned control and restraint. Any prisoner restrained by any mechanical restraint, physical hold for reasons other than escorts or use of pepper spray must be examined by a suitable registered health professional within 3 hours of the beginning of the restraint. And the training of health centre nurses in primary mental health will assist in helping people post-restraint by using communication skills to debrief with the person. This is also an opportunity to assess and reassess for mental health issues. Although not strictly related to the management of people with disabilities, Corrections has changed our policy for the use of mechanical restraints with pregnant women in prison to better protect mothers and babies in 2021, reflecting our acknowledgement of the importance of minimising restraint. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui. Neil, thank you for that comprehensive answer. In the interest of time, and I can't actually see anybody from education online.
Paula, Brian speaking.
Brian.
So I'm not from education, but for the purpose of this discussion and reading from the Ministry of Education website, just to point out, since 2014, seclusion has been banned in schools and early childhood centres in the review of the Education and Training Act 2020. And currently the Ministry of Education is consulting on the use of physical restraint and the guidelines that accompany the Act. And that consultation closes on the midnight, the 3rd of April.
Thanks for that clarification, Brian. I'm going to move on to question 2, and I'm going to turn to ask that on behalf of the IMM to Prudence Walker from the Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Kia ora, Prudence.
Kia ora, Paula. Question 2. The Disability Rights Commissioner has described violence and abuse of disabled people in Aotearoa, New Zealand as endemic. What action does the government plan to take to ensure past, current and future abuse and violence experienced by disabled people is exposed and eliminated? And as part of that question, what data and evidence does the government collect to ensure those in residential care settings are free from abuse?
Ngā mihi, Prudence. Audrey, to you in the first instance, please.
Yes, and then I'll hand over to Victoria, if that's okay, from Joint Venture Unit. As mentioned in the opening statement, the government acknowledges the higher rates of violence and abuse of disabled people and is firmly committed to the safety of disabled people, and also recognises family and sexual violence as significant public health issues. It is critically important that the health system is well equipped to prevent, screen and respond to family violence and sexual violence, including toward disabled people and tangata whaikaha Māori. New Zealand's first national strategy and action plan to eliminate family violence and sexual violence provides opportunities for the health system to contribute to the government's broader response to family and sexual violence. You'll hear more about this from Victoria in a moment. The health and disability sector has programs to detect, screen and respond to family violence and sexual violence. This includes the Violence Intervention Program. This is across all district health boards to train staff in hospital settings to routinely inquire about family violence, undertake early intervention and refer people to appropriate services. The health system reforms also present an opportunity for the Ministry of Health, Health New Zealand and Māori Health Authority to achieve equitable outcomes, access to health care and prevent and respond to family and sexual violence for disabled people, particularly tangata whaikaha Māori. This includes ensuring programs to prevent and respond to family and sexual violence, have kaupapa Māori models of care and are culturally safe and built on evidence that works for Māori. Action 28 of the new national strategy is to implement safeguarding responses for disabled and vulnerable adults. The safeguarding response that has been developed as part of the Mana Whaikaha EGL, that's Enabling Good Lives prototype, is also an important contributor for this action. Mana Whaikaha has gradually integrated safeguarding and supported decision-making into all aspects of its work. The government will build on the lessons learned to understand how this approach could work for all disabled people, and the Ministry of Health is supporting this action. Thank you, and I'm going to pass on to Victoria from the Joint Venture Business Unit.
It's Paula speaking. We've
Hello,
just got the
everyone.
cameras aligned. Please go ahead, Victoria.
Right, thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Victoria Manning. I'm a deaf person, and I'm currently communicating to you through New Zealand Sign Language, although you will be hearing a male voice interpreting me. I'm wearing a light white shirt, a burgundy jacket, I wear glasses, I have brown hair, which is long but pulled back today. My role in the place that I work is manager of the Joint Venture Business Unit, Eliminating Family Violence and Sexual Violence. As Audrey has handed over to me, it's my job here to explain to you firstly about our national strategy to eliminate family violence and sexual violence, and to talk about how that strategy is being implemented. The strategy is called Te Aorere Kura, the national strategy, and it was launched just at the end of last year in December. It is the first national strategy for eliminating family and sexual violence. When the government was developing that strategy, over the last 18 months or so until it was launched, it engaged with key stakeholder communities, diverse communities, including across the family sector, family violence sector, and the sexual violence sector. It spent 18 months engaging with various organisations and people, and that did include engagement directly with disabled people and disabled people's organisations and the disability sector generally. We took on board all of the stories that came through from the disability sector generally, and some very strong themes emerged from those consultation processes which influenced the strategy. And there were a number of things that came out of that. Disabled people said that the family violence sector and the sexual violence sector were not accessible to disabled people. They also said that the ableism contributed to the systemic barriers that they were facing in order to actually access its service, and that needs to be eliminated. They also acknowledged that there wasn't enough data or research that has been collected about disabled people and their experience of violence. There was also an acknowledgement that there is a service gap when accessing mainstream services for, in particular, people really from the ages of 18 to 65 who are not covered in the current way that things are supported. They also noted that across these two important sectors, there wasn't a great deal of communication or consultation between the disability sector and family violence and sexual violence. There was also very little data about the experience of gendered violence. So, for example, disabled men experience violence much more than non-disabled men. And that needs to be researched and it needs to be understood much better. Lastly, disabled people said that resolutions must be twin-tracked. They must include the development of the services, the work for and prevention in mainstream services, but also where specialist services or approaches need to be taken. So that intelligence collected from the community did influence our national strategy. And as I say, this is the first national strategy that a government has had in New Zealand to eliminate family and sexual violence. And the strategy timeframe is not a short one. It looks ahead to the next 25 years. And it does so for a very good reason, because there are so many changes that need to take place at so many levels in society that it could not possibly take a short period of time. It is intergenerational change and will require constant funding and support to truly achieve that dream. The strategy is also unique in another way, because it strongly focuses on well-being. We see that violence comes about due to other factors and other influences in people's lives, which increase the likelihood of violence taking place. And so by reducing those influences and supporting and protecting disabled people in all parts of their lives, we're able to see the reduction in harm. So well-being is the central focus of our strategy. Another unique aspect to the strategy is that it focuses on prevention. And where violence happens, that prevention must be in place before violence is likely to happen. It is an ambitious strategy, that is fair to say. But the government has recognised that it needs to take on new ways of working and new ways of collaborating with the community and the sectors jointly. I'd also like to say thank you to disabled people who have influenced this strategy, whose voices are directly reflected in that strategy, whose words are reflected in that strategy. Diverse experiences are reflected in strategy. And that's important to note because one way would not fit all, one size does not fit all. The diversity of that community must be recognised. There is also an action plan that underpins the strategy, and it focuses on a shorter time frame, 2 years of work that will feed the next action plan. And that will be a sequenced rolling action plan. Within the 2-year action plan, it will have 40 actions. And each of those will be led by a different government agency, supported by other relevant government agencies. All 40 actions will be overseen by an executive board. It'll be interdepartmental, it'll be a governance board, and it has been called the Joint Venture Board for the Elimination of Family and Sexual Violence. But because it's now a legal entity, it's called the IEB Board, the Interdepartmental Executive Board. The board consists of 9 government agencies, chief executives. And as I mentioned, the action plan has 40 actions, and all of them are equally important. Yes, it is the case that many of those will influence and impact disabled people directly, because it will be focused on direct services, on improving the experience that disabled people have when they're going through the system. But some of these actions are in fact directly targeted towards disabled people. And I'd like to go through some of those. Action 5. Action 5 talks about how the sector and the community will work together in new ways. And the way it will work is that the community will be able to directly influence the action plan. They will be part of the monitoring process. That requires a new mechanism, a new kind of entity to help support that work. And that's an essential relationship that will help that action come into being. So we're already talking now about how we will enact Action 5. We have a set of actions, a group of actions that will focus on workforce development. And that will be in particular for the general workforce for sexual and family violence, but also more generally with other agencies like the police, for example, where we want to develop their skills working with situations of domestic and family violence, including those where disabled people are involved or certainly at risk. Action 28, which Audrey just mentioned before, talks about safeguarding and the framework that will underpin that. The framework has been developed as part of the capability EGL framework. So we obviously have in Mid-Central, we have the Manawhai Kaha. We also have other pilots in Christchurch and Waikato, and all of those frameworks will support how we roll this out across the country. So that all will be folded into Action 28. And for Action 28, we'll be bringing in disability expertise once again. Actions 29 and 30 will focus on the service gaps that we have identified in the family violence area and also in the sexual violence area. What gaps exist and what needs to be done about them. We do know that these gaps exist for disabled people. They have told us that already. And so it is our job under these two actions to investigate the depth of these gaps and what needs to be done about them. To summarize, I'd just like to take us back to the beginning, that all actions are important under the strategy. But what I'm wanting to spotlight are the 5 actions that are right now that are about disabled people, where disabled people's voices are directly influencing the work that will support them in the future. And how can we use that model to work across the system? How will that model work? How does it need to be resourced? How does it ensure that those diverse voices from the disability community are truly heard and are truly influential? So that's a focus for us at the moment, developing that relationship. Thank you for listening.
Ngā mihi nui, Victoria. Was there anybody planning to add? If not, could I just ask a clarifying?
Oh, sorry, I was just going, sorry, apologies, It's Audrey here, Audrey Isbister. Just to answer very briefly, Prudence's second part of the question, which was about data and evidence, Prudence. So, and I can only focus my current response on the Disability Directorate of the Ministry of Health, which oversees the delivery of disability support services. So yes, the Ministry of Health does collect data and evidence on identified abuse in disability residential settings through a number of processes at each stage of contracting and funding a service. And I'll just briefly go over it because in the thought of what time we have. So one of the mechanisms is our portfolio managers that work in regions and within the communities. They visit service providers regularly, so they're able to talk about different things that do come up. We also have a auditing process called Health Cert. Residential care provided in any premises, that's including aged care, must be audited by independent designated auditing agencies. Then we have auditing and evaluation, and the Disability Directorate commissions external evaluations and audits of disability providers. So that is something that happens either on a consistent basis, or it can be almost a surprise one, a no notice audit. So these are experienced auditors and evaluators, and they can identify areas that require improvement. And I just want to acknowledge the importance of open and transparent complaint processes and the need for multiple complaint avenues. When a complaint relating to abuse is made to the Ministry of Health, the Disability Directorate handles the complaint in its entirety, responding and storing information and ensuring the safety and protection of the people that we serve. That's a very quick response to your second half of the question, Prudence. Thank you.
It's Paula Tesoriero speaking. Thank you for that, Audrey. That was going to be my clarifying question, so thank you for answering that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third question, and I'm going to turn back to Leo Mcintyre from Balance Aotearoa. Kia ora, Leo, over to you.
Kia ora, Paula. Thank you. Leo speaking. Projects related to involuntary sterilisation and other non-therapeutic medical procedures that are performed on disabled people have stalled. Noting that the Disability Action Plan explicitly includes exploring a framework for protecting bodily integrity, please explain why these projects have stalled.
Kia ora, Leo. It's Audrey Isbister here. The Ministry of Health recognises the importance of ensuring disabled people are valued as leaders in their own lives and have the authority to make decisions affecting their well-being, including full and informed consent to medical procedures. The action to explore the framework protecting bodily integrity is an important commitment in the Disability Action Plan, as you have rightly said. The Ministry of Health is undertaking work that responds to this action, but we recognise that there is more to be done. The reforms happening in both the health and disability systems create a strong platform for progressing this work. There are 4 key components to the framework to protect bodily integrity. The first one is increasing the capability of disabled people to be leaders in and have authority over their own lives, including developing and making available safeguarding and supported decision-making tools, which I briefly spoke about in terms of the Manaawhai Kaha prototype. Also providing training and support for health professionals to understand and meet the needs of disabled people and to communicate effectively with them and their whānau or advocates. Improving the data to confirm the number of disabled people receiving non-therapeutic sterilisation. And the fourth one is exploring legislative options to ban non-therapeutic sterilisation. A key part of the Disability System Transformation Work Programme is capability building for disabled people, tangata whaikaha Māori, family and whānau, ensuring they are valued as leaders and have authority over their own lives, as well as supporting people to engage across the system. The Enabling Good Lives demonstration sites and Manaawhai Kaha prototype have shown the importance and impact of capability development. And this is a priority in the work currently underway to prepare to scale the Enabling Good Lives approach nationally. This work will be led by disabled people and will contribute to disabled people's ability to give or withhold informed consent to medical procedures. Safeguarding and supporting decision-making tools are also critical components of the transformed system. Manaawhai Kaha has gradually integrated safeguarding and supported decision-making into all aspects of the work, and this will be a key component of national transformation. The other component of this is the Ministry of Health will be looking at how better to ensure our workforce represents the people and the communities they serve through an upcoming workforce regulatory reform program. This could include the introduction of minimum workforce training standards and embedding community voices and perspectives into that process to ensure the voices of disabled people are heard. Another aspect is improving data. The lack of data relating to sterilisation of disabled people is part of the broader disability data challenge across the whole health system, and the Ministry is working to address these gaps. The Contraception, Sterilisation and Abortion Act transferred to the Ministry of Health in 2020. Since then, we have amended the data collection regulations to include disability questions in the reporting under the Act. This will help clarify which sterilisations are performed on individuals who do not have the capacity to give informed consent themselves, and to help us to monitor whether the rights of disabled people with impaired decision-making capacity are being protected. These collections will produce a basic disability data set for these services. Alongside this, the Ministry is working with the disability community on a project that aims to identify disabled people in the National Health Index. This will create a platform for them or their advocates to signal their accessibility needs. This could include the need for supported decision making. Also part of this is exploring how legislative options to ban non-therapeutic sterilisation can work. And I acknowledge that the UN and the IMM have recommended that New Zealand should pass legislation to ban the non-therapeutic sterilisation of disabled people. The Contraception, Sterilisation and Abortion Act transferred to the Ministry of Health, as I said, in 2020. Since then, our capacity to progress the work to assess legislative change has been limited by the necessary focus on the pandemic response, as well as the health reforms and disability system transformation. We have identified exploring legislative options to ban non-consensual sterilisation as one of the 4 components of the Bodily Integrity Framework, and we will undertake further work on this when capacity allows. Thank you very much.
Paula Tesoriero speaking. Thank you for that, Audrey. Do you have any, just a clarifying question, you said when capacity allows, the legislative options will be further explored. Do you have a sense of timing on that or not at this stage?
To be fair, we do have a sense of urgency on that, Paula, and it's been part of the work program. With having our capacity completely compromised with other emerging actions or reactions, it has been a lot harder, but it is on the work program, and I couldn't give you a date on when that would start, but it is part of our policy program.
Okay, thanks, Audrey. Is there anyone else who wishes to add to Audrey's comments? No. Okay, thank you for that, Audrey. I'm going to move on to question 4 and turn back to Prudence Walker from the Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Kia ora, Prudence.
Kia ora. Describe the concrete measures and actions that are being taken to ensure that the inequities around life expectancies for disabled people, especially those with learning disabilities, are being addressed.
Kia ora koutou, it's Audrey Isbister here from the Ministry of Health. Thank you, Prudence. Achieving better outcomes for disabled people, their family, their whānau depends on transforming how government works for them. The current cross-government disability support systems prevents barriers for many disabled people and whānau in achieving ordinary life outcomes. Supports and services appear to be fragmented across multiple agencies, with no single agency responsible for system leadership or driving improved overall outcomes for disabled people. Barriers to accessibility also make it harder for disabled people to navigate the system and participate in everyday life. So in recognising that, these are barriers that have effects on overall health outcomes by disabled people, and especially those with learning intellectual disabilities, and it will continue to have a focus on improving health outcomes for all of disabled people. In 2015, a project reference group was established to guide the Ministry's work on improving health outcomes. While we have not been able to progress all the recommendations, the group work has continued to guide our approach. The Ministry has progressed actions in a number of areas, and these are upcoming opportunities to make significant further progress. The first one is data. The Ministry is working with the disability community on a project that aims, as I said before, to identify disabled people in the National Health Index. Having this information will enable us to develop a far more sophisticated picture of health outcomes for disabled people. It'll target health interventions where appropriate and understand how these health interventions work. The project will enable disabled people to signal the accommodations they need in order to be able to access health services so that current barriers can be addressed. The Ministry is also committed to increasing the availability of alternative formats and accessible information. This has been a vital part of our COVID-19 response and has led to increased internal awareness across the whole Ministry of the importance of ensuring that everyone can access information in a timely way. The Ministry of Health also uses disability support services provider forums to provide advice and information to providers on how to support the sexual and reproductive health of disabled people within their services. The information given to providers at these forums was well received, and feedback indicated that this was a topic that there had been some hesitancy to approach previously. And while these forums are a great starting point, there needs to be more done in order for it to result in measurable improvements. There is also opportunities to progress work to lift the capability of the health workforce to better respond to the needs of disabled people as part of the upcoming Workforce Regulatory Reform Programme. This could include the introduction of minimum workforce training standards and ensuring the voices of disabled people are heard when setting other relevant standards. And also the health reforms. So despite the progress that the Ministry has made in some areas, we recognise that there is much more to do to address the current inequities in health outcomes, particularly for those with learning intellectual disability. The health system reforms provide an opportunity to strengthen this work and ensure that the needs of disabled people, including those with a learning intellectual disability, are met across the whole health system. The government has signalled its commitment to future development of several national health strategies, including a disability health strategy through Paiora Healthy Futures Bill 2021. The Ministry is committed to working with the disability community throughout the health reforms to ensure disabled people are a priority population, and improving equity of health outcomes is a key focus of the reform system. Thank you.
It's Paula Tesoriero speaking. Thank you for that, Audrey. Is there anyone, Audrey, who will be adding to that? Nope. Okay, thank you for that, Audrey. I'm going to move on to question 5 and back to Leo Mcintyre from Balance Aotearoa. Kia ora, Leo.
Kia ora. Thank you, Paula. Leo speaking. How is the government planning to ensure that disabled people are not negatively impacted by the End of Life Choice Act? And what data have you collected so far to inform this planning? For instance, how will the government ensure that disabled people are not impacted by a lack of safeguards against coercion, feelings of being a potential burden to family, devalued identity, and lack of even or equal choices in the absence of properly resourced support and palliative options?
Kia ora, it's Audrey Isbister here from the Ministry of Health. We have Derek available to talk to that question 5 response.
Morena everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. You might see me in just a second.
We can see you, Derek.
You can, okay, all right. Technology, it's fun, isn't it? All right. My name is Derek Senior. I'm a manager of family and whānau policy at the Ministry of Health. I'm also visually impaired, which is why you're going to see me turn off to the side in just a second so I can read some comments from a large print document. And I'm going to try and get through this reasonably quickly because it's a long response, but I'm mindful that time is pressing on and we'll be able to ask questions and things later on. So the government recognises that assisted dying is an issue on which philosophical, moral, religious, ethical and clinical views are divided. The government acknowledges that there are strong feelings about assisted dying from some sections of the community, both for and against, including parts of the disabled community. Following the passage of the End of Life Choice Act, assisted dying is a legal service in New Zealand, and as such, the government is tasked with ensuring that assisted dying is available and accessible, and that it is provided in accordance with the Act, which includes ensuring that all eligibility requirements and safeguards are followed exactly. There are strict criteria for who qualifies for assisted dying. In order to receive assisted dying, a person must be aged 18 years or over. They must also be a citizen or permanent resident of New Zealand. They must suffer from a terminal illness that is likely to end their life within 6 months. They must be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in physical capability. They must experience unbearable pain, unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner that they consider tolerable. And they must be able to make an informed decision about assisted dying. The Act explicitly states that a person cannot be eligible if that person is only suffering from a mental disorder or mental illness, has a disability of any kind, or is of advanced age. I'll pause here to make a particular point that I think is relevant to the disability community in particular, which is when the End of Life Choice Act was a bill going through Parliament, the bill as it was initially introduced and discussed at Select Committee had a much broader scope than the bill that was passed through Parliament at the end of the process. I won't go through all of the changes that were made as part of that process, but one that's really noticeable is the original bill included a criteria that would allow people to be eligible if they suffered from a grievous and irremediable condition. That has potentially a much broader scope in terms of capturing people that are not terminally ill and within the last 6 months of their life, and would potentially have had a much greater impact on the disability community. But that criteria was removed by Parliament before the bill was passed. I mention this because it's something that comes up for us at the moment. So there are still people who will engage with the ministry and ask about who's in and who's out, and including people who may think that they're eligible and actually find that they aren't, because the scope of the bill is a lot narrower than it was when it initially went through. Just something that I thought was worth raising. Before an assessment, to determine if someone is eligible, they must be provided with information by a medical practitioner that enables them to make an informed decision. That includes telling them about the prognosis for their terminal illness, explaining the irreversible nature of assisted dying and the anticipated impacts of it on them, and discussing with them their other options for end-of-life care. A person has to be assessed against the eligibility criteria by 2 medical practitioners, including one who is deemed to be independent. A person must be found competent to make an informed choice about assisted dying by these 2 medical practitioners, or, if one or both of them can't agree, a psychiatrist. Someone is deemed to be competent to make an informed decision if they can understand information about the nature of assisted dying that is relevant to that decision, retain that information to the extent necessary to make the decision, use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision, and communicate that decision in some way. There are also a number of protections in the legislation around coercion. In particular, a decision to seek assisted dying can only be made by the person themselves. The use of advance directives, decisions by welfare guardians, and other matters related to assisted dying made by other people is explicitly prohibited by the legislation. Health practitioners are also not allowed to raise assisted dying with a patient in the first instance, or make any suggestion that a person exercise the option of receiving assisted dying. Essentially, the patient must raise it first.
Derek, it's
Yes.
Paula speaking. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but it's just we've only got 1 minute to go, and you're doing a really thorough job of taking us through the legislation. But I think you can assume the IMM knows the legislation. I'm wondering if you might spend the next minute just specifically addressing the point about, you know, this question's really getting at the monitoring side of things. So how you know those things you have talked about are working adequately for the protection of disabled people, and we do only have 1 minute left, so it may be something that you need to come back to us on, but I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, we may need to. Essentially, the End of Life Choice Act is very prescriptive about how the process has to work. In fact, it's a lot more prescriptive than most other legislation I've ever read. And what that means is that there's a very clear process for government officials to follow. In the case of the Ministry of Health, that means having a team of people that oversee and support the process. There is an extensive, for lack of a better term, recording of information and accountability mechanisms in the system, including I forget the number of forms now. I lost count when it got to more than 20, but essentially everything that happens throughout the process is documented, and all of this information and practice is reviewed both by the registrar, and there are also statutory bodies that oversee the process. We do have, in terms of monitoring and data collection, we do have arrangements in place to collect data on assisted dying and to monitor it, both in terms of qualitative and quantitative information. We want to understand not only what's happening and who's going through the process, but also the experience that people have, both people seeking, but also their whānau and practitioners providing the service. And we have a number of mechanisms in place, including internal monitoring, official reporting, and later this year, we'll be doing a post-implementation review once the service is in place for a year to do a comprehensive examination of how it's been implemented, essentially from top to bottom, to see what we can learn and how we can improve it.
Paula speaking. Thank you for that, Derek. That data that you talked about, will that be publicly available at some point?
We're working through that, but yes. So one of the reasons we collect data is the Act requires us to do some reporting, but we're also mindful of the fact that the public need to have trust and confidence in the system. So transparency is going to be important, obviously acknowledging that privacy is also important. So we're doing some work at the moment around exactly how detailed we'll be with what we release. But yes, there will be information released publicly. It's really just a question of the detail.
Okay, thank you. It's Paula Tesoriero speaking. Thank you for that, Derek, and I'm sorry your time was a little bit cut short, but you did get to the nub of the question, so thank you for doing that, as well as providing an overview of the legislation. We're now going to end this part of the session and take a break. It's 10:22. We are going to break and return at 11 a.m. The IMM will now deliberate on the responses that we have received from the government. Thank you to all of the officials who have provided really comprehensive answers this morning. We're going to deliberate on those, have a look at the questions that have come through Slido, develop our supplementary questions, and we look forward to coming back together at 11. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. We will begin in 60 seconds.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Thank you everybody for joining. You are currently listening to Paula Tesoriero, the Disability Rights Commissioner. Welcome to session 5 of the Independent Monitoring Mechanisms Forum on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where the IMM are asking government representatives a series of questions relating to integrity of the person. This is part 3 of today's session. We've had a series of pre-prepared formal questions put to the government and heard their responses, and the IMM have just deliberated on the responses provided by the government, and we have developed some supplementary questions using both the information that has come through from the public on Slido and also questions that the IMM want to further ask the government. So thank you everybody for coming back, and we're now going to ask a series of supplementary questions. For those who are listening, so disabled people, tangata whakaha Māori, and family and whānau, and members of the public who are listening, if you have asked a question on Slido and you don't hear it asked exactly, or you don't hear the question that you put up, please be reassured we have read them all. We have tried to incorporate as many as possible, and where we have not been able to do so, we will follow up with the government at a later date. I'm now going to hand to Leo Mcintyre from Balance Aotearoa to get us underway with the questions. Kia ora, Leo.
Kia ora, Paula, thank you. It's Leo Mcintyre speaking. This question is directly for Audrey. What is the government doing to address cruel treatment of autistic children, including practices such as applied behaviour analysis?
Kia ora, Leo. It's Audrey Isbista here, Ministry of Health. I'm going to refer the question to our Chief Advisor, Dr. Amanda Smith, in the Disability Directorate for the Ministry of Health. Amanda, would you be able to please respond to that question?
Sure, kia ora, it's Amanda speaking. So the work that we do in relation to ASD is guided by the Autism Spectrum Disorder Living Guidelines. And our position is that all behavioural intervention should be of good quality and incorporate a number of principles. These include person-centred planning, functional assessment, positive intervention strategies, and a focus on environment that creates meaningful outcomes for people with autism. We encourage a positive behaviour support model rather than an applied behavioural analysis model for people with autism.
Thank you, Amanda. It's Paula speaking. We also recognise, Audrey and Amanda, that there might be some other agencies who may want to add to that. I'm not sure that they're all here today. So is it possible to take away an action to provide a written response for the IMM on that question, just with the information that you provided, Amanda, and then any other government agencies, perhaps Brian, who might like to contribute to that.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Brian speaking. I'm just again referring to the ASD guidelines around interventions for children. It also describes what good looks like for the education sector.
Great.
As well as for health professionals. And it emphasises the team around the child, that training in one location separate from other children is not good practice. I think this question refers to the Lovas technique developed by a psychologist in the US, which has quite aversive practices in terms of training interventions for children with autism. So I think I would refer to the guidelines and inclusive.tki on the education website, because that also has a section on working with children on the spectrum.
Thanks, Brian. I think that just to add, sorry to prolong this question, but the question is really getting at what is the government doing to address this issue. And so I think what will be important is in the follow-up information. It's great to know there are guidelines. Thank you for sharing that with us. The important thing will be how we all have can take some reassurance in the way that those guidelines are monitored. So any information on that would be particularly helpful by way of follow-up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. And also, I forgot to mention earlier, it's Paula speaking again, apologies. We have had some messages via social media that it would be good for officials to just remember when using acronyms or any particular jargon related to an agency that people listening externally may not know what those mean. So just to try and avoid using acronyms where possible. Thank you, and back to you, Leo, for the next question, please.
Leo speaking. How will voices of tangata whaikaha Māori disabled people be given space in the work program underway to repeal and replace the Mental Health Act?
John.
Yeah, I think that's my question. It's John Crawshaw speaking. As part of the public consultation, we deliberately sought out the views of lived experience as part of the process for ensuring that we had the breadth of experience across the country in terms of views about what should be in the Mental Health Act. We're also in the process of setting up an expert advisory group. And one of the important aspects of that expert advisory group is that we have a balance of Māori as well as lived experience in that expert advisory group. So I can assure you that we are very serious about ensuring that both lived experience and Māori are represented as we move forward with the policy program.
Thank you, John. Can I just clarify? That's really good to know about the expert advisory group. Are you indicating that there is likely to be representative of tangata whaikaha Māori, so Māori disabled people?
I can't say for sure because we're just in the process of setting it up. We did go out and ask for expressions of interest, and we are going through that process now.
Thank you, John. Leo.
Shall I move to the next question?
Sure, thank you.
Leo speaking. What is Corrections doing to find non-violent methods of removing disabled prisoners from cells or enabling them to stay in cells safely?
Paula speaking. Have we got corrections with it? Oh, Neil.
Yeah, kia ora, Neil Beals here. So we have training for our staff in a variety of techniques. Obviously, the first thing we will always seek to do is try and de-escalate so we don't need to use force. And very often, we have time on our side to be able to do that. So the urgency to move somebody from a cell is not always immediate, but sometimes it is, and we need to get somebody out of that cell for whatever reason it may be. And the techniques need to take into account, obviously, the environment, but also if somebody is disabled, and we've had examples of people in wheelchairs, then the staff need to make sure that they take every precaution with that, and if need be, take medical advice first. From if it's a planned removal, in this case it would be in the example that you've given. If it's a planned removal, we would have healthcare staff in the vicinity.
Thank you. I'll move to the next question. What is the government doing specifically to implement recommended measures to address life expectancy for disabled people? An example might be the introduction of funded annual health checks.
Paula speaking. Audrey, can I hand to you in the first instance?
Certainly, Paula. It's Audrey speaking. I'm going to hand this to Hannah Kerr. Hannah, you're online. Can you please respond to this particular question on annual health checks?
Yes, no problem, Audrey. I hope you can hear me. It's Hannah Kerr speaking from the Ministry of Health. My connection hasn't been great this morning, so I apologise if it freezes. Annual health checks was one of the key recommendations of the project reference group that we worked with on the health outcomes and access action under the Disability Action Plan. The evidence for the impact of annual health checks for people with learning disabilities in particular is strong, and we have progressed work to look at possible approaches and to identify the one that's likely to be most effective in New Zealand. The one that we've identified is called the Comprehensive Health Assessment Programme. I'm mindful of not using acronyms, but it can be abbreviated to CHAP, which was developed by a GP here in Aotearoa. It's a multidisciplinary approach, and it includes medicine reviews, recognising that polypharmacy is a particular issue for people with learning disabilities. In terms of progressing that work to implementation, it's the sort of initiative that will be high on the agenda when we're looking at initiatives to include in the Disability Health Strategy, which Audrey mentioned in one of her responses. The Paiora Healthy Futures Bill will require for the first time that we have a disability health strategy. And given the evidence for annual health checks and the work that's been done, it's certainly one of the areas that we will be looking to include in that.
Thank you, Hannah. It's Paula speaking. That was a comprehensive answer, thank you. I'm conscious that we used an example in that question of funded annual health checks, and Hannah, you've talked about the program of work that might have other things that you're looking at. This question is also relevant for other government agencies in addition to the Ministry of Health, and I wondered whether there were other agencies who might like to contribute to that question. I think that's a no.
It's something that we could follow up on and provide a written response. Some of those agencies may not be on the call, if that would be helpful.
That would be helpful. Thank you, Hannah. It's Paula speaking.
If I may add to it, I wonder whether the health plan that you spoke about should include analysis of the social determinants of health and how that might apply to across government.
Yes, that will absolutely be another key part of developing the strategy.
Thank you. I'll move to the
Hannah.
next question. Sorry.
You go, Leo.
Thank you. Leo speaking. What is the government specifically doing to address ableism and autism as factors that result in disabled people feeling pressured to end their lives.
Audrey, in the first instance, can I hand that to you, please? It's Paula speaking.
Thank you, Paula. It's Audrey speaking. I would need to hand this to my mental health colleagues who lead the suicide prevention. I wonder if there's any other people that feel that they could respond to that from the Ministry of Health, because there's a lot of work that has been done across the ministry on with disability and issues, but John, I'm not sure whether you would be okay to respond to this question particularly.
Not really, because it's not my field of expertise. I think we might need to come back with a response, Paula, because we don't have our suicide prevention office colleagues on this call.
Brian speaking. If I could make a response, and I think Brian Coffey speaking from the Office for Disability Issues, I think Leo kind of indicated this as in terms of the determinants of health. So actually, if you look at the entirety of the disability strategy and the action plan, and the focus on all dimensions of a person's life, from education to accessibility, attitudes, employment and economic well-being, as well as health. I think we just need to kind of remind ourselves that the reason we have action plans and strategies is these things work together, not in isolation. That may well address to people feeling valued about their life, and that's something that we measure in the Stats New Zealand Wellbeing Survey.
It's John speaking, John Crawshaw. Can I just clarify, Leo, was the question really aimed at the end of life bill, or was it more broadly? Because I just got confused with the question.
Really, it applies across both things, John, I think, because certainly there is that question of whether disabled people experience ableism and autism as a factor in considering whether to use the End of Life Choice Act. There's also the more general case. So I think it applies to both. And in response to Brian's comments, I think, yes, it's essential that when we're looking at things systemically like that, it's really important that ableism and autism and also systemic racism are considered as factors across the way that the system is operating, to make sure that we're taking account of that in the responses that we're generating.
Kia ora, Paula, is it okay if I add something? It's Juanita from Corrections.
Yes, please go ahead, Juanita.
Thank you. Maybe a little bit to both of those questions around the End of Life Choice Act and this suicide prevention approach from Arataputama's perspective. Leo, starting with the Suicide Prevention Action Plan, we have developed and just launched the first Suicide Action Prevention and Postvention Plan for Arataputama just a few weeks ago. And this does align closely to the plans and direction of travel out of the Suicide Directorate at the Ministry of Health. I think where this is nestled within Arataputama is we have work to do with the vulnerable people within our prisons who have high rates of mental health addictions, physical health issues, and around, I think our data would tell us around 25% of them have some level of functional impairment. So on top of that, what we are also building over the next 2 years is a kaupapa Māori health service, which will take a holistic approach to the entirety of the needs of an individual and be considering what those determinants of health are, which will both support wellbeing in oranga and maybe impacting on someone's ability to work through the prison or the community corrections context, both to have a life worth living and to be free of our system. So we very much have a suicide action plan, but a work in progress how we ensure that is holistic in terms of the other questions that you asked around in terms of the needs of an individual from a psychosocial perspective. The second thing around the End of Life Choice Act, this is something, because we have a health service within Aropautama, we have also developed a policy for our employees about the procedures and guidance to follow if a person in our care or management asks for information about and/or access to assisted dying, both in the community but particularly in prison, of course. We are aware that there's a significant ethical considerations within our unique context within a prison regarding coercion and pressure. We're aware this is due to such things as the nature of prison life, pressures from others, potentially from within prison, and increased likelihood of significant, for example, mental health issues impacting on a person's mental health and well-being, and that these factors may lead to a greater risk of coercion from others when someone is considering whether to activate the legislation and requested dying. To address this concern, there's a number of things we've done, but the one particular that we have embedded in our policy, but perhaps the one particular thing to call out in terms of a mitigation around the risk of coercion in our context and to safeguard people in our care and management, their whānau, and our workforce, is that for all assisted dying requests in a prison context, both the attending medical practitioner and the independent medical practitioner are independent of corrections. So they do not work for us, they're not internal staff, they're not contracted staff, so that our medical officers and nurses will not be undertaking those assessments and to ensure that there is an independence from us as an agency that can be considered to have some coercive elements and from this important decision that someone may want to consider making as part of their rights based on the legislation.
Thank you.
It's Paula speaking. Thanks, Juanita. I can see that Victoria Manning has her hand up. Victoria. It's Paula speaking. We're just waiting for the speaker for the sign language interpreter.
Hi everyone, Victoria Manning here. Apologies for that slight delay there. We were just swapping over interpreters. Victoria Manning, manager at for elimination of family and sexual violence. I would like to add a response to this question about ableism. I think it's a powerful question, and that we see that ableism pervades society at all levels, and at the systemic and structural levels of our community. And how we resolve that, you know, is more than one question. But I think one response to this is that we all need to recognize ableism. And I think one example that I can give from what we are doing here at the joint venture, when we were putting together the national strategy, is that disabled people were telling us we must be able to identify ableism, and we must be able to identify that it is one of the influences and in fact often a cause of the violence promulgated against disabled people. We must be able to name, identify and highlight ableism, and so that is clearly stated in our strategy. Through the engagement process with the community, a lot of people actually weren't aware themselves of what ableism is as a theoretical concept. And so in the back of our strategy with our action plan, we have a glossary that defines some of these high-level terms. Because of course we also need disabled people themselves to be able to articulate when and where they see ableism, when they reflect on what's going on for them in their daily lives, and when they reflect on resolving ableism. So that's one example, but I know that other government departments have done similar processes where they've identified ableism as a notion, as a concept, and are actually working towards addressing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. I can see that Adam Dalglish has his hand up. Please go ahead, Adam.
Kia ora tātou. Ko Adam toku ingoa. My name is Adam from the Ministry of Health. I just wanted to first off thank the IMM for the extremely thought-provoking and relevant question. And also for the contributors that have already spoken for, I think, quite artfully getting to some of the many different pieces that make up ableism. One of the really important threads that's come up in some of our work in the Ministry of Health has been around disabled people feeling dehumanized by the need to constantly repeat their stories and advocate in order to receive accessible services. Amongst the data work that Audrey was talking to earlier is a process that's trying to embed a sort of data process in the ministry where disabled people are able to record their reasonable accommodation needs and then have those needs communicated proactively to the health service before they attend services. And one of the really key kaupapa or purposes of that system is to allow disabled people to express once clearly what it is they need, and then have health staff proactively meet those needs and have that sort of follow them around the system. And as someone who has a disabled wife who experiences some of this, I know that disabled people often interact quite a lot with the health system, and it can be quite dehumanizing and degrading to constantly have to go through that experience. So that's one of the things that's on our quite active work program to try and address this ableism question. Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora, Adam. Thank you for that. It's Paula speaking. I might now turn to you, Leo, for the next question.
Thanks, Paula. Leo speaking. Given that New Zealand isn't yet at the target of zero seclusion, and we currently see tangata whaikaha and tangata whaiora Māori secluded at higher rates than the general population, what specific actions are planned to reduce solitary confinement rates of tangata whaikaha and tangata whaiora Māori?
I think that I'll start with a response first. It's John Crawshaw speaking again. The Ministry's reporting on the use of seclusion has highlighted the issue that you have expressed, particularly in terms of rates of seclusion for Māori compared with other ethnicities. And we know that there are also serious inequities for Pacific people. These inequities are unacceptable, and while there's some good news, as I indicated before, in terms of the data HQSC has reported, I think that there's still much that needs to be done to actually address this. Hence why they have developed the clinical bundle and the cultural kitty to actually look at what are the practices that can change on the ground to ensure that right from actually when people come into hospital versus when they may get to a point of needing seclusion and restraint. Equity and upholding Te Tiriti are driving principles in the work that we're doing to repeal and replace the Mental Health Act as well. And our work program to improve the application of the legislation is also driven from this perspective. But there are complex issues, and really we're talking about practice change. Hence why we've got the training program that we're developing with Te Pū, hence why we have the quality improvement program with HQSC, which has its own Māori caucus, which is actually driving some of the work in terms of what will make a difference on the ground in terms of individuals who are experiencing seclusion and restraint, and also what will make a difference in terms of how staff approach that issue.
Thanks, John.
Leo, back to you.
Are there any other agencies that want to respond to that question?
Kia ora, it's Neil here from Corrections. First of all, just on a technical point, we don't use the phrase solitary confinement because under the Mandela rules, that is somebody who's been secluded without meaningful human contact for at least 22 hours. And as you'd heard me say earlier, when we operate our segregation processes, the people under segregation generally interact with quite a large group of people throughout the day, including our health staff as well. However, for want of a better word, segregation, seclusion, keeping people isolated from others or restricted falls under the same umbrella. For us, Hokarangi is our main strategy, obviously, looking at the humanizing and healing approach in terms to as we progress with changing our custodial practices within the sites. And as I said earlier as well, that's always got to be balanced with the safety and security of all involved. So, you know, the more mental health training, the more mental health provision that we have in prisons, the wider understanding of that, the more cultural training and appreciation that our staff are able to absorb, I think will eventually we'll see the tide turn in that, and we'll start seeing less aggression, less violence, and less security risks that tend to lead to the need for segregation. There will always be a need for it. Unfortunately, that's the reality of prisons. Those of you who have been inside there understand the nuances that prisons bring. But it is in everybody's interest to try and reduce the amount of segregation, reduce the amount of use of force, reduce the amount of restraint, in order so that we progress with Hokarangi and towards a more humane and healing environment.
Thanks, Neil. I'll move to the next question.
Yeah. Thanks, Leo.
Thanks. The next one is, why hasn't the Ministry of Health put a moratorium on the practice of non-therapeutic sterilisation until such time as this issue can be worked through with disabled people and their representative organisations?
Thank you, Leo. Hannah, I'm not sure if you're in a position to answer this question. I know that I'm not, so we can come back to you with an answer on that. But Hannah, are you okay to respond to that particular question?
Kia ora, Audrey. I think if we can come back to you with a response on that, Leo, that would be good, if that's okay.
It's Paula speaking. That is fine. Thank you for offering to do that, Audrey and Hannah. I guess just to really, underscore the importance of this question, which is that we understand that various pressures over the last 2 years may well have clearly impacted the ability to progress some legislative reform, and we acknowledge that, but we think it's absolutely critical that non-therapeutic sterilisation stop in the meantime. And so we would be interested in the Ministry's support for that, and if not, an explanation as to why that's not possible. So if you are able to come back to us on that would be appreciated. Thank you, Audrey and Hannah. Leo, back to you.
Thank you. Next question, Leo speaking. Does the government acknowledge that there has been a lack of focus on the integrity of the person in policy and legislation?
I might open that up for Brian. Sorry to put you on the spot. Is that one you might want to kick off? It's Paula speaking.
Kia ora, Paula. I'm trying to find my microphone is giving me time to respond to your question, and even taking that time, I don't think I'm in a position to respond to that. We'll follow up on that. Okay. Unless colleagues from health would like to make a comment.
Kia ora, Leo. It's Audrey Isbister here from the Ministry of Health. I would refer to my colleagues if there's anybody there that wants to respond to that. Otherwise, we can come back to you with some kind of response, if that's okay.
Thank you.
So if I, Paula, it's John Crucial speaking, if I could just answer in a limited case. In terms of the repeal and replacement work of the Mental Health Act, it's one of the principles which we laid out and that Cabinet has agreed is that any future legislation will be consistent with human rights, and that's part of our guiding principles as we do that, but I can't answer the broader question. I can only answer it in the narrow.
Thanks, John. It's Paula speaking. It would be great to get some follow-up information on that as you've offered, Brian and others, so thank you. Leo,
Paula,
would you?
Just for clarity, could we just have the question asked again, just so we absolutely get the wording right on it?
Sure. The question was, does the government acknowledge that there has been a lack of focus on the integrity of the person in policy and legislation?
Okay, thank you.
So the next question, why are government projects stalling in the bodily integrity space or moving incredibly slowly? For example, why has the working group on bodily integrity stalled?
Thank you, Leo. We can give you a more fulsome answer, which aligns with your question before as well. As I mentioned in my sort of opening address, the capacity of the work, the program, or the ability to continue that piece of work has been constrained by our global pandemic, and we're very mindful of the fact and being truthful with the forum that we haven't progressed the work.
Thank you for that, Audrey. It's Paula speaking. Does anyone else want to add? No.
Brian speaking. It just seems there's a number of questions here around the same issue. So if we come back with a response that addresses each of these issues in a one response, would that be helpful to the forum?
Yes, that would be helpful. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Leo.
Thanks, Paula. Leo speaking. I think that probably applies to the next question as well, because it is somewhat related. How can the government move integrity matters forward when New Zealand is still largely following a substitute decision-making approach? I think that's probably a related question, and perhaps in favour of time we could move forward to the next one and ask for that as a written response too. Unless there's anyone who particularly wants to respond to that one.
I can speak obviously about the Mental Health Act, but however, I am aware that this may well come up in this afternoon's forum when there will be other agencies present, and it may be that we need to reconsider whether the answers given this afternoon adequately address the concern.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, it's Paula speaking. Thanks, John. I'm conscious that that's true of that question and potentially true of some other Slido questions that have come through that we have not asked in this session, but have transferred to this afternoon. So thanks for that, John. Back to you, please, Leo.
Thank you, Paula. Leo speaking. What plan does the government have to improve the collection of data and evidence on abuse and violence experienced by disabled people?
Thank you, Leo. It's Audrey Isbister here from the Ministry of Health. I'm going to refer this question to Adam, who is the SME on a data program of work. Adam, are you able to respond to that question, please?
Kia ora, Adam speaking. I'm not sure I can speak directly to sort of family and sexual violence type spaces, but the kaupapa that we have underway to identify disabled people in the National Health Index sounds quite simple, but actually unpacks into an incredibly large amount of stuff. So depending, if any of the existing health information is used to track family or sexual violence, then having disability in the NHI should enable the sort of teasing apart of disabled and non-disabled people. The National Health Index also contains a wealth of other information, including ethnicity information, so you'll be able to see things like tangata whaikaha Māori, Pacific disabled, rural, urban. It really unpacks into an awful lot of stuff. There's other data related stuff attached to that same project, but I think that's the one that's most relevant to the question you're asking. I don't know if anyone else has something more specific to say about these kinds of violence and data.
It's Paula speaking. Victoria Manning.
Hello, Victoria Manning here again. With regards to the Joint Adventure Board, who are responsible for our strategic plan and action plan, as I mentioned, there were 40 actions that came out of that work, and 2 or 3 of those actions are deliberately focused on measurements, frameworks, outcomes, targeted research, data and evidence gathering. And those actions will be led by the Social and Wellbeing Agency. So we are working in close collaboration with them on those specific actions. They'll include some long-term outcomes that we are looking at and how we would measure those outcomes. And the work is starting now, really, based on previous work that has built over the years. And we will be engaging directly with the disabled people to help inform that work and to help inform the shape of those desired outcomes, as well as the measurement of them. So I think there's some improvement there that's demonstrating that, yes, we recognise the need for more data and evidence. We also have to make sure that that work is connected to the data and evidence working group. So we need to make sure we have that relationship there as we move forward and as we really try and refine what it is to gather statistics on family and sexual violence. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for that, Victoria. I can see that Brian has his hand up. Sorry, it's Paula speaking.
Yes, just to add to Victoria's response, actions 38, 39 and 40 in the Te Aorere Kura, the Enduring Spirit of Affection strategy, are related to data collection. And in there it also cites the continuation of the crime and victim survey run by the Ministry of Justice. Again, in recent years, we've been able to disaggregate that data by disability on the basis of the work of the Disability Data and Evidence and Working Group. And up until that was done, there was very little evidence of the concerns that are raised in the family violence and sexual violence strategy around disabled people. We relied almost entirely on international literature. But yeah, so there is certainly the need to continue that work, and it's absolutely there in the strategy.
Paula speaking. Thanks for that, Brian. We've just got one last question, Leo.
Sorry, left myself on mute. Can I just quickly go back to Brian for a very brief explanation, please, of what is the Disability Data and Evidence Working Group? I'm just aware that people listening in may not be aware of it and its work.
Thanks, Leo. I'll try and respond briefly to this. The UNCRPD, and the last time New Zealand was examined at the UN, a key theme that came out of that examination was the lack of disability data and evidence. So in response, the government put together an interagency group that includes representatives of the disability community as well as academics, and it has a work program now that is around increasing the capability and ensuring that disability questions are included in all of the surveys and census that government runs, as well as promoting better data through administration collections by agencies.
Thank you. And the purpose of collecting that data is to enable specific actions to support outcomes for disabled people.
Absolutely. I think, as we said in the Dr. Jonathan Godfrey said right at the start of the forum, he acknowledged that data collection, but data collection without action just leads to dissatisfaction.
Thank you.
It's Paula speaking. Adam, is your hand up from before or a new hand?
New hand.
Please go ahead.
Just speaking to that distinction between administrative and non-administrative data, one of the things that's worth highlighting is that the vast majority of data currently collected on disabled people is survey data, which will provide us snapshots of what's going on sort of intermittently. There's a real lack of real-time person-level data coming on. So when we're talking about identifying disabled people in the National Health Index, it's really quite a big deal. So as an example, when we were doing the COVID response, there was some frustration from the community and others that there wasn't really live updated information on vaccination rates for disabled people. And a big part of the reason we weren't able to do that is that our administrative collections weren't disaggregated to identify disability. So we're really trying to get at a really core bundle of issues that are important to community, including having the right data to drive actual outcomes as opposed to just snapshots of what's already happening. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Adam. Thank you for that. Leo, back to you for that final question. Thank you.
Paula. Leo speaking. What plan does the government have to ensure supported decision making is at the forefront of policy and legislative decisions?
Kia ora, Leo. It's Adria's Vista here from Ministry of Health. As I said in one of my opening statements, supported decision making is a integral part of the work for systems transformation, and with a new ministry going forward, it's something that you'll find embedded into any of the policies and processes going forward. So the government is planning on a whole new approach to working with disabled people, which is about disabled people's leadership and the Enabling Good Lives approach. So that's a very broad answer, and I don't know if any of my SMEs that are on this would like to explain anything a bit further on that, but that is work in progress in terms of that program of work. And so I can speak for the Disability Directorate within the Ministry of Health at this point. Hannah, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Audrey. It's Hannah speaking from the Ministry of Health. I just wanted to also mention the review that the Law Commission is currently doing on the law relating to adult decision-making capacity. They're reviewing all the legislation that touches on this, and will be making a series of recommendations at the end of the review. I know they're working with agencies across government, including the Ministry of Health, and supported decision-making, and how to support that process better is a core part of the review.
Brian, it's Paula speaking. Your hand is up.
Yep. Kia ora, Brian Coffey speaking. This is also a part of the Disability Action Plan. There was work done with a sector advisory group on developing a resource around supported decision making in the non-legislative area. That there's still more work to be done on that. I think what we got is a document that describes supported decision making, but the advisory group has told us we need to take that to a next step, that it's a resource that actually people will be able to use either in the provision of services or at a family and whānau level.
Thanks, Brian. John, your hand is up.
Yeah, just to add to, and I responded on this earlier, and will this afternoon, as one part of our new guidelines, we have actually quite heavily emphasised supported decision making. While we can't change the legislation, we can support the sector to implement supported decision making, and also talked about advanced directives. So it is part of the consultation process that we undertook in terms of the repeal and replacement of the Mental Health Act, and it is certainly part of the focus that we'll be doing as we develop our policy around the new legislation.
It's Paula speaking. Thanks for that, John. Brian, is your hand up?
Yeah, so just to add at a very practical level, a guidance was supported on supported decision making for access to vaccinations in the vaccination rollout. So quite a comprehensive resource for family and whānau was developed around that, and for vaccinators.
It's Paula speaking. Thank you for that, Brian. Okay, I don't see any other hands up or indications, so we will draw those supplementary questions to an end. Ngā mihi nui everybody for coming back. Can I ask, Brian and Audrey, I'll address this question to you. You've undertaken to come back in writing to some things, acknowledging that you know, that there may be people away and things over the coming weeks, but is the end of April possible to come back to the IMM by? This just will help us get prepared for our UN report.
Brian speaking. I think in previous sessions we said that you would give us a specific date at the end of April, so that we know.
29th of April?
29th of April, that's pretty close to the end of April. Okay, let's go with that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey here. Yeah, we'll go with that one. Thank you, Paula.
Okay, just stay in touch if that presents a problem for other reasons, but thank you for that. So thank you everybody. To people who are listening, we have managed to get through a number of supplementary questions, including many of those on Slido. Some of the ones on Slido we have moved to the session tomorrow, so you might find that your question is asked there, and if it has not been asked, then we will be following up separately with government. Thank you to all the officials who have come along today and prepared answers and responded to supplementary questions. Your time is really appreciated. Thank you, Audrey, for your leadership in this session from the government side, and thank you to my IMM colleagues. I am going to hand back to Mātua Ron to close us out in the appropriate way. Kia ora, Ron, over to you. Ngā mihi nui.
I've got to do that. Oh, yes, it's done. Kia ora. Kia mihi nui kia tātou e te iwi. Huri noa, huri noa. Isn't it enlightening? I always find these discussions enlightening about. The responses are difficult for all of us, because they seem to be at different levels of of structure and procedure and delivery, but it's progress. And I think progress is the thing for us. But mihi nui ke tātou huri no, tēnā koutou. Ka huri anō tō tātou nei pokaro ke runga ke ki tua hingaro. Our thoughts again go to our Creator. Nō reira e tō mātou matuutarangi, Almighty Heavenly Father. Tau pai hoki mātou kei mui a koe anō, as we come before thee again. Whakapiri mai kia mātou. We ask for thy presence to be with us. Hei tau ake nā manakitanga ki rongi mātou katoa. And bless all of us who have deliberated this day. Mō e nā kōrero e whāriki hea wai nei mātou for the discussion and the kaupapa we have placed before us. Nō reira manaki tia mai. Manaki tia mai. Manaki tia mai. Ka tira e te matua. Mo tēnei wahanga, and at this time, e whakakapi nei tēnei tō tātou nei kaupapa ke runga hoki te ngua tapu tō tātou kaipakora ake. Amen. And we close our time together this morning, ke runga the many blessings of our Creator. Nō reira huri no, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou nā.